You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lay Miller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. When I surveyed more than 4,000 American adults about their sexual fantasies for my book, Tell Me What You Want, one of the surprising things I found was that nearly 1 in 7 people reported having had a fantasy before in which feet or toes had played a prominent role. So why is that? How does something like feet become erotically arousing to so many people in the first place? It turns out that the eroticization of feet has a very long history. It's not a new fetish by any stretch of the imagination. So in today's episode, we're going to trace the history of foot fetishes and explore where this interest comes from and why certain body parts become sexualized in the first place. We're also going to talk about how foot fetishes went mainstream, how the internet may be changing interest in feet, as well as why men seem to be more likely to have foot fetishes than women. My guest is Adam Smith. He is a writer and multi-format producer. His books include Deep Sniff, A History of Poppers and Queer Futures, as well as Soulmates, A History of Our Fetish for Feet. He also writes theater shows and podcasts, including Press Play, Turn On, which won Podcast of the Year at the British Podcast Awards in 2024. This is going to be a fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around because we're going to dive in right after this short break. Do you want to learn more from me in the form of an online or in-person course? Become Sexceptional by getting certified with Sexual Health Alliance, where you can learn from yours truly and a number of top sexuality scholars. Each year with Sexual Health Alliance, I teach courses like Fantasies Around the World, as well as immersive study abroad classes in several exciting countries. Join these programs and become a certified sexuality professional at the same time. From sex therapists to sex educators, sex coaches to sexologists, Sexual Health Alliance streamlines your path to certification while allowing you to learn from leading experts in the field. Most importantly, you'll gain the knowledge, skills, and credentials that you need to excel. Become Sexceptional and connect with world-class experts and an engaged community of sexuality professionals from all across the globe. Start your path to certification today at sexualhealthalliance.com. Hi, Adam, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin. It's a big pleasure to speak to you, so thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you about your books that you've written because they are on fascinating topics. So you recently published a book called Soulmates, which is all about the history and evolution of foot fetishes. So I wondered if we could start with what's the brief story behind that book? Why did you decide to focus on foot fetishes in particular?
Well, I guess 2 reasons. One is because I have a fetish for feet. And, you're told to write what you know, aren't you? I guess that hadn't really been done before in a way that I would do it. But the other reason was connected to that really, which was coming off of my first book, which was about poppers, which I also really like. And I had written a book about the history of poppers, and then I toured it and did lots of events where it was just really fun to talk about it and to hear other people's stories with poppers and their reflections on the histories that I had found and covered in that book. And it felt like I was able through that work to really connect with people because it was my thing, but also then I had gone away and done all this research and then written something that connected with people. And then I was having great conversations with people about it. So I was thinking, okay, well, what's the next thing that I can do that with? And the next thing is another thing that I have, which is a thing for feet. So that was where the idea for Soulmates started to come from. It was kind of listening to what I wanted to do and then, taking a gulp and doing it,
Yeah, I understand that. And, it certainly is a lot easier to get up the motivation to write when you're writing about what you know. And in this case, in particular, if it's something that you enjoy, I know from previous experience writing books, sometimes getting up the strength to do that, man, it can be a lot.
Yeah. And you've got to have something to really carry you through, especially because you can't guarantee that it's going to be published or that even if it is published, that it'll find its people. It's a big job to do. And so the only thing that can carry you through is if you really care about it, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree 100%. So, for how long have humans been fetishizing feet? Like, is this a newish thing that people kind of like recently discovered, or does it seem to have a long history? Is it something people have always been into? What did you find when you started looking into the history of foot fetishes?
Yeah, well, I'm not aware of any like prehistoric cave art with people sucking toes while the bison maraud around in the background. However, it is a very, very old thing. And one of the things that was really surprising to me when I looked into it were the early traces and some theories, some traces and some theories about, let's say, love for feet more broadly, even in like the Middle Ages. There's this historical evidence of sexually transmitted infection waving over Europe in I think it's the 14th century. And at the same time, there's more poetry, which is basically love poetry for feet. So there's this theory that playing with feet was a way to be protected from other sexually transmitted infections that you might get if you rub your genitals together. So the idea of, first of all, that love poetry exists, whether or not it's connected to the STI outbreak or not, like that poetry exists with odes to feet in those medieval poems. And so I just find that really interesting. Similarly, one of the most famous Bible stories is Jesus washing the feet at the table before dinner. Although that's not an explicitly like fetish or sexy thing, I put that on a spectrum really of love for other people and through the medium of feet. And so that's obviously a really old story. Whatever that story means to you and whatever Christianity means to you, like that's there in the records. And it's another really, really old story. And although I couldn't go into this in loads of detail because the book had to be quite short and it was a really short research period for it, I did find traces in lots of different cultures at the same time or like in different times. But the fact that it seems, I don't want to say the word universal, but like it seems to be there like in different ways, in different cultures, in different times. And so that was just something that was really interesting to me. And also on the other hand, gratifying in a way, like validating to be like, okay, well, this is a human experience, it's happening across time and space. And so therefore it's real. And it's not just because people are monetizing their feet now on OnlyFans. This has been going on a lot longer.
Yeah, it sounds like something that has a very long, very rich history. When you're sort of looking at the way that feet have been depicted historically at different times, they've had different social and cultural significance and meaning. And that's something that might also contribute to how feet became sexualized in some way. But I've always found it really fascinating, that connection between epidemics of STIs specifically and the rise of foot fetishes. There's this research paper that found, I think there were 4 different historical epidemics where you could see this big rise in depictions of feet in art and so forth that were tied to those particular periods. And one of the most recent ones was actually during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and 90s, where they actually found that there was this sort of exponential rise in foot-related media and erotica. And so there does seem to be something to that kind of like when the genitals become a little bit more dangerous because of STIs, that people start to fetishize other sorts of things, including the feet.
Yeah, I think there's a broader truth about that, which I've noticed just in recent years, especially, I guess, in my own consumption of porn and also general consumption of culture. We're in a kind of golden era for maybe foot fetishes, but definitely like feet involved in sex. And I've noticed that we're in that kind of golden era, because it's more and more in porn, as porn has, and the different things that are depicted as proliferated in recent years, but also just in broader culture. I think it's been referenced a lot more. You have it turning up in TV shows like House of the Dragon and Fellow Travelers. That's a really sexy scene. I'm now just remembering it in my mind as we talk. And I've just noticed that it's been going up. And I don't want to say that there's a social contagion thing happening where like just because it's a trend or it's popular that other people are jumping on it. But I do think that it's something that can get destigmatized, just like anything, everything needs to be destigmatized. But like, I think when there's a blossoming of it and there's a more visibility for it, then it destigmatizes it, or at least de-risks it for people to try and to do it. And then therefore that then produces like more representations and more visibility of it. And just like even at the level of just people talking about it and saying openly that they've sucked someone's toes, So I do think that it has this like magnifier effect, just like anything really. And that's what openness and talking about it is good for, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, I think more broadly, there's been a mainstreaming of kink in recent years. And through just the broader lens of BDSM, we've seen lots of different ways in which that has permeated pop culture. But I think in terms of fetishes, specifically fetishes related to feet, we've seen that appear more and more in media in recent years. I remember the first time it sort of came on my radar where I was like, I wasn't used to seeing like people sexualize feet in a certain way, was when the television show Weeds was on. There was a big scene involving feet there and foot porn. And that was kind of like the first time it hit my radar as like, oh, this is now starting to enter pop culture. And then since then, we've seen this sort of big change over time. And, even to the point where when I was home over the holidays visiting my family, like somehow the subject of foot fetishes came up. My mom raised it because it was in like some show that she had seen. And, my parents feel free to ask me sex questions because they know what I do for a living. But, sometimes they're like, what's up with this thing that I saw on TV? And, the fact that my parents are seeing this and, it's permeating the shows that they're watching says, yeah, there's something to this spreading and being destigmatized.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be surprised if you invite Justin round for dinner and feet fetishes don't come up, or some kind of kink is going to come up. Like, obviously, like that's what you expect when Justin is over for Thanksgiving.
Yes, absolutely. It doesn't matter where I go. Some kind of interesting sex topic is going to become part of the conversation. Something I was thinking about before the show was how, body parts just in general don't have fixed meanings. And the context of the situation can change whether a body part is seen as erotic or if it's just kind of neutral or even negative. And I'm wondering, in thinking about sort of how the meaning of feet themselves have shifted over time, right? There were certain periods of time where feet tended to be more hidden from view, right? And also where feet were things that were directly modified in ways that conveyed certain social status. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the shifting cultural context around feet and how that might have contributed to their eroticization.
Yeah, going back to the Jesus story, the thing there is that Jesus lowers himself in order to clean the feet of the people before they have dinner, which was the thing that you would do. You'd clean your feet before you have dinner. And if someone's doing that for you, they're basically a servant. So Jesus is telling you there that he is like a humble servant and he might be the son of God. But if he's lowering yourself to your feet and cleaning them, then he's like a normal person. He's just like a normal person and he can love people at the same level as well. That's an obvious one in one particular place and one particular tradition. Another thing that your question makes me think about is lotus foot and the practice in China in history of binding the feet. And I wasn't sure whether that would be part of the story of our fetish for feet. And there are competing theories about that. And for sure, it seems to be mostly now it's kind of like accepted that it was sexist and that it's like controlling women and what they can do. But it's also got this sexualization element to it, which is also part of a society controlling women. But like, I thought it was interesting how like it literally changes the shape of the foot into a way that is seen as more desirable. And there's a theory about that it kind of scrunches the foot up in a way that it looks like sometimes what you do with your feet when you're having an orgasm, where you bend your toes in and scrunch your feet up. So it forces the feet into that permanent position, which is like sexy and desirable. And I thought that was another really interesting one because it's just another kind of interesting cultural context, I guess. And then there's the classical stuff about in different eras of conservatism, like the Victorian times. I mean, there's the classic thing about Victorians not showing their ankles. I live in Britain, so this is like a very common thing that we say, like, oh, she didn't even show her ankles. And covering up, just basically covering them up and keeping feet covered as a way of saying, like, I'm chaste, basically. What I found really interesting is over the past few decades, like, there's been more permissiveness, I guess, in our attitudes about like showing feet, with things like flip-flops and stuff like that coming in and sandals. But also at the same time, what that has done is drawn more attention to feet. And a lot of people have their feet like stigmatized when they wear sandals or flip-flops. Like it's a really common thing. I remember when I was growing up, it was kind of a joke and you were kind of gross if you wore shoes that showed your feet, especially if you were a man. Like there's this idea that like flip-flops on men are like really disgusting and that men's feet are gross and everything. And I don't know if that is still an attitude. I mean, I'm sure it's still an attitude now. I don't know how pervasive it is because I think there's been more feet on show basically. But I just find that really interesting. And I don't know what your thoughts are on it about how it's just like anything, isn't it? Like cultural context and attitudes of the day really define and shape how we view certain body parts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, I'm not going to shame anyone for their choice of footwear with one exception. Like, I can't get behind socks and sandals. Like, it's just like, make a choice.
That's still a really divisive one, yeah.
Yeah, you can do one or the other. Like, you can wear socks with shoes or you can wear sandals. Like, you can't have both. But yeah, I mean, I hear those comments sometimes about, and it makes me think about differences in how men's and women's feet are perceived. And when I'm thinking about this in the context of foot fetishes, we primarily hear about it as something that men are interested in, heterosexual men sexualizing women's feet or gay men sexualizing other men's feet. We don't really hear so often about women fetishizing men's feet. And I think you can think about that through a historical and cultural lens where men's and women's feet have just kind of been seen differently. If you think about media and advertising and you think about the phenomenon of high heels and women's stockings and all these other things where you're seeing women's feet projected in media in ways that emphasize that, the feet and the legs, like that these are very sexy features and body parts, but we don't quite tend to see the same thing happening for men. So I was just wondering if, when you were doing this dive into the world of this history of foot fetishism, did you come across instances where women were into men's feet, or was it primarily about men being into feet in general?
Yeah, well, so there is some research on this, which I quoted in the book. I can't remember whether it's your research, Justin, or someone else's that found basically looking across the different gender and sexuality categories of people that express an interest in feet is that like the gay men are the most common and then the straight women are the least common, if you like. So you've got gay men, then straight men, then gay women, and then like straight women. This is obviously very rigid categories, but it's a sort of broad brushstroke point, which I think gets to a truth of what people would have observed anecdotally as well. And that's based on like big survey data. So I think there's something really interesting in that. And I think there's something really interesting about it intersects with if you're already from a minority sexual identity, then does that make it easier somewhat to do the thing that's like also shamed, or stigmatized in some way? So I think that's an interesting one to think about. You're right to say, and for sure, like when you go into like kink archives or artwork or literature, it's mostly straight men fetishizing women's feet and women in high heels as the number one kind of shoe wear, but also other kinds of shoe wear. So that is predominantly there. Obviously, like straight men outnumber gay men massively. So it'd be interesting if the numbers were the same, then would there be more gay men doing that? But that's definitely true. But you do see instances of women doing it. And I interviewed a sex worker and performer called Reed Amber for the book. And I quote her in the book quite a lot because she was basically doing foot fetish content for clients, for men, with their desires, for their gaze. She was kind of doing that for them as a service before she sort of started to actually explore it for her own sexual pleasure as well. And then she did, and she realized that she actually also has that pleasure. And specifically for her, she really likes to be tickled on her feet and tickling other people's feet, especially women. Yeah, she likes playing with women's feet. So that was a really eye-opening interview for me because it's just something that is less represented. And there's sexism in that, obviously. And there's also the statistics in that, which is what we were talking about, is that it seems to be statistically like a lower occurrence than men who have it. Mm-hmm. So that was just something that was really interesting to me. But then having since published the book came out in the UK about a year and a half ago. So I've done quite a few events in bookshops and other spaces since then. And I have to tell you that like the data that I just said about like it being more straight men and gay men is not borne out in the people that come to bookshops to hear about these stories. Sometimes sometimes more than half the people are women or AFAB people who come to those events, and they share at those events in the bookshops that I've been doing. So obviously bookshop people are like a smaller category, but it's telling to me that it's interesting. And a lot of women have kind of come to me and said like, oh, I do this thing, or I like this thing. And that's something that I hadn't really known, that I hadn't had that much exposure to. I guess I'm a gay man, so it's not obvious that I would bump into it, I guess. But that was just something really interesting. And the book is going to be published in the USA in the spring. And so I'm going to be interested to see whether there's going to be a similar thing there of like lots of US women coming forward to me and telling me their stuff.
Yeah, so feet are something that anybody could potentially be interested in. But I think it's important to highlight, when we're talking about something like a fetish, that can mean different things to different people. And I think historically, clinically, we've tended to think about fetishes as well. If you're into feet or you're into this thing, that you're only into that and you can't be turned on by anything else. And if you don't have that fetish object present, you can't become aroused, stay aroused, or have an orgasm. And what we've seen in recent years is that fetishes actually really run on a spectrum. And, for some people, it is that exclusive attraction to a particular object, whereas for other people, it's just kind of like a nice enhancer. So, what you were saying about what some of the women were describing, where they're like, I actually kind of like it when men do this, or my partner does this to my feet, and that's enjoyable. And that's a case where it could just be more of an enhancer fetish as opposed to like an exclusive fetish. So I think it's just worth highlighting that it runs on a spectrum. And I think there's probably a gender difference there, where men are much more likely to fall into the exclusive category with feet, whereas for women, it can be something they're more just open to dabble in, but maybe they don't necessarily identify as having a fetish.
I think that's probably right. And that's also another great thing about feet is the low barrier to entry. Like literally, like it's something that is easy to dabble with. If you can get over the ick factor that a lot of people do have, and I would encourage people that have an ick factor to think about why they have an ick factor about feet, But if you can get over that and you can experiment, then it could literally be you having a foot massage or giving a foot massage. And like, that's a really nice thing to give or receive anyway. And that might lead to other things, And so it's a really pretty easy thing. You also don't need any equipment. You don't need to spend any money. Those things are important to me, not because I'm tight, but just because, having sexual fetishes and, if you don't have like a regular partner, you can end up spending money trying to find sex and spending money to get into clubs or spending money to get the gear, and all of that's right. Those are legitimate businesses and you need to spend money, but like, you can spend a lot of money. So it's nice to have options that don't cost anything and you've got your feet. And so have a massage or give a massage, and it's a nice way to dabble and see what happens.
Yes. Well, feet are free unless you're getting pedicures, which can cost a lot of money. But anyway, so I was going to ask, how do you think the internet has changed the visibility, normalization, or expression of foot fetishes? I know we talked about it a little bit in terms of like how things have changed in popular media, but just broader access to the internet, I think, has also helped to bring foot fetishes to cultural consciousness, which is why, going back to something you mentioned earlier, you mentioned something about, selling pics of my feet. And that's sort of become like this tagline that lots of people say. In some ways, it kind of trivializes foot fetishes, where it sort of implies that like anybody could just get out there and sell pictures of their feet and be successful at it. But, it turns out that it's actually a lot harder to monetize things sexually than people might think that it is. But anyway, I'm just curious, what do you think about just the internet in general and how that sort of changed the ability for foot fetishists or enthusiasts to connect and for interests to grow and be normalized?
My first answer to that is I saw a news article today that Mark Zuckerberg and Meta are closing down the metaverse, which they spent £8 billion inventing, which is this kind of, I don't know even what it was, like a VR internet space. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that it failed because you couldn't do feet on it. That's why I think it failed. Because the fact is, I mean, obviously I'm being a bit silly, but, the internet has like exploded foot content and foot pleasure and everything like that, just like a lot of different things. And it's not only made it way more visible and accessible, and people have been able to like share their things and meet other people a lot more. It's also kind of helped to create it as well. You know, like anything, especially with sex culture, there are like ways that people do foot related stuff that is because of the medium of the internet. One thing that's really helped grow the visibility of feet as like a sexual thing, I think, is the fact that they're literally not genitals. And so Instagram is probably like one of the biggest places for foot content. And it's very sexual, but it's just not falling foul of Instagram's community guidelines, you know, and Facebook's, where you're not allowed to have sexual content, which I find really interesting, because it's like, well, what is sex content anyway? But literally on Instagram, there are like people sniffing each other's feet and showing off feet and all of that stuff. And it's like, to those who know, it's like obviously sexual, and it's able to proliferate there. And that's great, and that's fine. And then I think the other thing is obviously performers and models using OnlyFans and similar platforms to sell things. Again, it's a really low barrier to entry. It's a thing that a lot of sex workers and performers start with, and they build an audience with it because it's relatively easy. They don't even have to show face or other body parts, and they just sell their feet pics. And some people apparently make a lot of money doing it. I should be doing that rather than writing books, honestly. If I actually want to cover my rent, maybe people can get in touch. But like, I just think it's interesting how it's like really exploded, and then it's created certain kind of cultures. You know, there are certain kind of, it's a bit like a lot of porn. Like, there are certain kind of erotic images and positions now that only exist because they've fit inside the kind of standard size photo that people share on Instagram. And it's like, that's an image and a position that you wouldn't have done if it wasn't for Instagram creating that frame for you to put yourself into. That's really interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think there are so many other ways that the internet, the media, modern technology have changed and are shaping our sexual interests. And I'm actually writing a new book right now about the neuroscience of sex, and I'm talking about some of these things in it. So I look forward to sharing that with the world a little bit later.
That sounds great.
But in the meantime, I'll be selling pictures of my feet to pay the rent as well. So
yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks for this amazing conversation, Adam. I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation in the next episode and talking all about the history of poppers.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new books?
Absolutely. So yeah, my website is adamsmith.com. It's Smith with a Z, Z-M-I-T-H. Although I should say Z for the American listeners. So yeah, just adamsmith.com. And the Poppers book is called Deep Sniff. And the foot fetish book that I wrote is called Soulmates. Soulmates is actually, it was published in the UK, but it's actually coming out in the USA in the spring, in May 2026. So I'm super excited about that now people can get it in bookshops in the USA as well. So all the foot freaks in the USA, and just anyone who's interested in the history of feet fetishes, can get it. I also just published a new book in the UK as well with a co-author, Tash Walker. That book's called The Logbooks. So we'll see how that one does, and then hopefully that might make it to the USA as well.
Well, great. I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Justin. It's been lovely to speak to you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller, and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.